Hello, I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar on cultivation and seed bank management for improved weed control by Eric Gallandt of the University of Maine, Orono. My name is Alice Formiga, and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension. We're a community of cooperative extension personnel, researchers, ag professionals, organic certifiers, and practitioners. You can find all of our published articles, videos, and recorded webinars about organic farming on our website at extension.org/organic_production. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce today's speaker. Eric Gallandt is Associate Professor of Weed Ecology and Management and Chair of the Department of Plant, Soil, and Environmental Sciences at the University of Maine, Orono. His research is focused on understanding weed population dynamics and improving weed control on diversified organic farms. After the presentation, which will last about 45 minutes, we'll have about 30 minutes for questions and answers. So, Eric Gallandt will be coming on now, and before he starts his talk, he asked me to run a quick poll for the farmers in our audience to find out whether or not your weed problems are increasing, staying the same, decreasing, or if you're a farmer and you don't have a weed problem, you can check the last box. If you're not a farmer, maybe hold off. But we'll have this up for about 20 seconds or so, and when those farmers have voted, we'll show the results, and then Eric will begin his presentation. So I'm just going to close the poll, and I'll share the results here and see what it looks like.
All right.
35% increasing. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. And Eric, so I'll hand things over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Alice. Well, first, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for tuning in. And I thought I'd start off with a little bit of context for this. I work in Maine, and to orient you, if you're not familiar with Maine, here we are. This is the area of Maine where the moose live and where the lobster are from. And yeah, moose and lobster, we're probably known best for that. But Maine actually has a very diverse agriculture and a long history in organic farming. We presently have about 380 certified organic farms in the state, and these are the farmers that I work with. And despite my best efforts, weeds continue to be one of their largest problems. And last year, when I got a hold of the certification records for these farmers, and one of the fields in particular that said, how do you manage your weeds? And I copied that block of text and I pasted it into this really cool thing my kids taught me about called Wordle. You can check that out online. And clicked the Wordle button, and this is what shows up. And you can see that, this is how these 380 organic farmers in Maine control weeds. And the size of the word here is representing kind of the frequency with which that word was present in this large block of text. So a lot of hand weeding. Now, hand weeding is great in that it's incredibly effective. You can get, essentially 100% weed control. But it's also really expensive. That's one problem. And secondly, the expense increases proportionally with increasing weed density. So as any of you that are doing any hand weeding know that if you have an increasing number of weeds in a field, it's going to take you longer to hand weed. And it's going to just add to the cost there, even if you're treating your employees really well with this deluxe self-propelled hand weeding unit here, complete with the face pad for ultimate comfort. And the problem here really are the intra-row weeds, those weeds that are growing in the crop row. It's really quite easy to control weeds between crop rows. So inter-row weeds in this area here between crop rows, that's not a problem. It's pretty easy to find a tool, piece of steel that you can drag through there to kill small and large weeds alike. But it's the intra-row weeds that end up being a real problem. A second problem with cultivation is that efficacy is often really variable. And what I mean here is that the proportion of weeds controlled varies from perhaps as low as 10% on up to maybe 95%. And the sources of this variability are numerous. The weed species, the size of the weed, soil conditions, the adjustment of the tool, the skill and experience of the operator, all are going to affect efficacy. And a third problem with cultivation is that the efficacy is density independent. And I'm going to talk more about this a little bit later on, but basically what this means is that while we would like to kill in ever increasing proportion of weeds as you get more weeds, it just doesn't work like that. If you're going to kill 60% of the weeds, it doesn't matter if you're starting with 100 weeds or 1,000 weeds, you're going to kill 60%, which is fine, but the thing that you need to think about are the 40% that are surviving, and 40% of an initial population of 100 is a much lower density of survivors than an initial population of 1,000. And so consequently, if you have a higher starting weed population, then you're going to have to either try to increase the efficacy or cultivate multiple times, taking out 60% at each event until you get the number of survivors to be sufficiently low. All right, so that's problems. What about some solutions? And there's really three that I want to talk about today. I mean, clearly there's the other option of just weeding more, and a lot of farmers do that and can be very successful at it. But if you want to not necessarily just keep cultivating more frequently and adding more cultivation events, I want to talk about strategies to try to get closer to the crop row, so reduce that intra-row area, or in other words, maximize the weeding of the inter-row, the part that's pretty easy. I'll next discuss a few things that could be done to improve efficacy. So what could be done to move from, say, killing 60% of your weeds to maybe 80% or 90%. And then the last section of the talk, even if you've invested perhaps in tools to increase precision and learned more about the biology of weeds and learned how to adjust tools to improve efficacy, a final strategy is to try to start with a lower initial density of weeds that you have to cultivate. And to do this, you need to start with a lower seed bank. All right, so we'll start with the first section here, talking about how to get closer to the crop row. And the goal here really is to minimize this area right around the crop row. So what you want to think about here is that every centimeter closer to that crop row that you can get with a tool is a centimeter multiplied by however long your rows are, less hand weeding that has to be done. And there's quite an array of tools that can be used to try to get closer to a crop row, including shields like these rolling shields or these sliding shields here that protect the more tender crops from soil movement. But again, the goal is to get tools that can get as close to the row as possible. And here's just an example from a Dutch onion field looking at cultivation that resulted in a 2-inch untilled band in around a single row of onions. And you can just imagine now if instead of having 2 inches to hand weed, you had 4 inches to hand weed. You extrapolate that over a field of this size, and you can see the increased or the savings in hand weeding that can be achieved by simply getting closer to the crop row. And there's been some really great innovations in recent years related to this so that we can both get precise cultivation, so tools very close to crop rows, and maintain high working rates. And if you're a large-scale producer, this is just one example that you can find online, the Robocrop system. But essentially there's this and others, but basically you have a parallel linkage set up on the toolbar and then a camera that is following the crops in the row and then adjusting the side-to-side movement of that toolbar on the fly so that the working rate of this tool can be impressively high. 4 miles an hour, 5 miles an hour sort of speed. So that sort of vision system is sort of costly, though, and on a little bit smaller scale, what we typically see are people that are using tractors that are really specifically designed for cultivation in mind. And here's an example from a Danish research farm where I was working, but you can just get the idea here that we have basically this tool carrier that looks kind of like a road grader you might see in the U.S., but the point is that this operator has incredibly great vision down to this tool and to the crop rows. So this would be sort of a larger version of what a small-scale producer might be doing with an Alice G, for example. So you have both really specialized cultivating tractors, and this is just one example, and I can send you links to more. There's actually quite a number of them from Northern Europe. Unfortunately, we don't see them being marketed or sold widely here in the U.S. Despite some really clever designs. This is actually a little bit older one. There's some new ones that are even more clever than this. Another thing that this particular tractor can do, and you could actually think of it more like a tool carrier, is that it gives you an immense space for hanging bits of steel. So lots and lots of, here we have some Danish S-tines, and there are those rolling shields I showed you. And then we've got some rolling basket here that are going to sort of break up clods, and then some spring-tines that are going to further shake small seedlings away from those clods. You can just imagine that, by the time you start putting a lot of things together like this, that you can start to, dramatically increase your efficacy. So here's an example where you might go from, say, 60% weed control that you might achieve simply with S-tines to, maybe 90% weed control with this combination of tools. On top of that, you have this great visibility, so you've got precision, so you're getting as close to the row as possible. There's also some great innovations for mid-scale producers. Here's an example of something from a Swedish company, the MacTrack, sort of a clever design for a little bit smaller scale. This is that sort of European toolbar design that can be hung, where implements can be hung from the bottom of it without interfering with the clamping mechanism on the top. And also at the smallest scale, we have perhaps the ultimate in highly sophisticated guidance systems, the human eye. So you can get very, very close to the crop row with these sorts of precision guidance systems. Okay, so one of the first areas then is try to get closer to the crop row, and I've shown you a few examples of tools that can be invested in to do this, as well as the importance of visibility and an example of technology in terms of a camera-guided system. All right, but what about those weeds that are in the crop row that you're just not going to get with any of these tools? Well, perhaps the most widely used tool in this regard would be things like a rotary hoe or a Spring-tine harrow. And this is what we call blind cultivation, because you're basically cultivating both the crop and the weeds, and you're relying on the size differential between the two. In this case, we have a winter wheat field. This is Per Group, a Danish organic bread wheat grower, and using a Spring-tine harrow here to remove small weed seedlings from an established crop. And so you rely on the fact that the weed seedlings are tiny and the crop is well established in order to, and the crop can then survive the action of these spring-tines. The tines can be adjusted to be more or less aggressive. And one of the problems with this, though, is that in order to control larger weeds, you have to be more and more aggressive. And so the more aggressive you are, the more soil coverage of the crop you're going to have, and the more crop damage. And so you are actually, experiencing some crop damage and some yield loss due to this operation. And so it's this careful balance between the need to remove weeds, which are going to reduce the crop yield, and then the damage that the cultivation event itself is going to cause. And again, this sort of tine harrowing or blind cultivation, the efficacy can be really variable. Here's some data from Lauren Kolb, a former PhD student who worked in organic barley and spring wheat crops. And you can just see over 3 of her experiments, this tine harrowing efficacy range from 65%, pretty good, to a low of below 20%, 15%. So variable efficacy affected by, again, the species of weed, the size of the weed, soil moisture, surface conditions, speed, and time settings. And when all of these things come together, it can be really great. And we have a year like that, and people go out and buy tine harrows. But then we have a few wet springs, and everybody parks them in the woods, and we're sort of stuck once again. Overall, when we think about the control of intra-row weeds, so the weeds in the crop row, we've really not made in the past 20 years a huge degree of progress. We're relying on pretty low technology techniques and generally poor selectivity. So here's an example of tine harrowing, and sure, you can do it in onions, you can do it in beans and sweet corn, but again, you're balancing this crop damage with the weed control. Something that's a bit more selective are finger weeders. We don't see a lot of these in use, perhaps because of the initial cost. Again, these are fairly sensitive to soil conditions and weed size. So these are going to only work on very tiny weeds. But if conditions are right, they can do a really remarkable job of removing small seedlings from within that crop row. Post-directed flaming, again, this is something that is suitable for a few crops. Onions, one example. And another example are the torsion weeders. Now these, like the finger weeders, these torsion weeders can be adjusted to nearly overlap if the crop is fairly large, or they can be spread farther apart if the crop is fairly small. Very inexpensive. Lots of planes of adjustment, which is probably one of the reasons why we don't see these so common. So that's intra-weed control as it stands. People are working, there's quite a lot of active research in this area. If this is something that you're interested in, you could go to a Danish engineering site, which is www.fp-engin.dk, and that's the Polson company. Here's an example of one of their prototypes, which is a very clever device. And again, this is for research purposes, but it gives you some idea of where people are going in this effort to control weeds within the crop row. And here, a camera is detecting the crop plants in the row, and then a computer is using the detection of that crop plant and the forward speed of the unit to turn off these propane burners wherever the crop plant is located. And so this unit has a whole range of flaming orifices that are turning on and off as the unit passes by a crop plant. A similar example from a research group that I've worked with in the Netherlands. Here again, using a light sensor, and in this case we've got a hoe that's going between the row of onions, and then there's a single hoe here associated with each onion row, and that hoe is actually on a pneumatic pivoting arm, and it's moving in and out of that onion row based on where the crop, based on where a light sensor detected an onion plant. And just one other example is sort of the future of this sort of work. At some point we'll probably be seeing robots doing this work. Robots that either use camera systems to recognize crops and weeds. I mean, if the new iPhoto can recognize faces in your photo collection, it's not such a far stretch to have a computer algorithm that can recognize lamb's quarters by leaf shape. And then the second area that people are doing research on is actually kind of knowing where crops are located based on GPS associated coordinates with planting technology. This is an example of a contest being held in the Netherlands where different engineering groups are building robots, and then they have specific tasks to do. Again, this is still a little bit out there. As far as I know, there's one example of a robot that is commercially available, but I'm not aware of anybody that has purchased one yet. All right, so that's sort of the higher tech area, and for what's going on for improved weed control for sort of large to mid to small scale farms. At the really small scale, though, one could say that innovation in the area of tools for small scale producers is really lacking. One notable exception in this area that I became aware of while on sabbatical in Denmark was a tool developed by a farmer in Finland, Petra Leonin, and he developed this tool he calls the Weed Master. And it's a fairly clever design in that it relies on a couple of toolbars here. And so it's sort of bringing this idea of a toolbar from tractors to human power. And a second innovative part of this is this use of parallel linkage units. Now, this is pretty low-tech stuff for tractor farmers, and basically what a parallel linkage allows you to do is adjust the depth of your working implement. So the depth between this guide wheel and this implement is fixed. You adjust this standard right here, and if you put it deeper, this is going to roll along the soil surface, but the depth that this is going stays the same. And this is very useful on a hand tool because it controls your depth, so you're not working any harder than you have to. And then the toolbar aspect of this is, I think, clever because it allows you to attach different sorts of implements. You can put a planter on this or a flaming unit and so on. We took this out last couple of summers to do some on-farm trials and compared this Weed Master tool to what some of our cooperating farmers' favorite tools are. Here at the Fisher Farm, the favorite tool for onions, for example, is the collinear hoe. And one of the real notable differousnces here is in the working rate. It took Beth and Dennis here 6 minutes to weed two rows of onions 100 feet long, and then Beth came back and did the same thing in about 30 seconds. I mean, it would have taken another couple passes to finish up some of the weeds between the rows, but you get the idea. It's really quite fast. And the efficacy, surprisingly, was fairly similar in the two. And so we did some other comparisons of this Weed Master tool with various attachments, sweeps, finger weeders, the Weed Master with disc hillers, and we compared working rates, so row feet weeded per minute, to a typical wheel hoe, then a couple of long-handled tools, a short-handled tool, and then hand weeding. And the Weed Master tool, just the way that you push this, it ended up being 2 to 4 times faster than some of these other techniques. And you might say, well, okay, so you've kind of convinced us that the wheel is this great invention, which, is really kind of true, so it's not really particularly remarkable in that regard. But simply documenting the magnitude of working rate, I think is pretty useful to start to see how investment in some innovative tools could really pay off. All right, so that is showing some ways that there are tool options out there perhaps to improve efficacy. What about actually simply improving the efficacy of the tools that one already has, or improving the efficacy of these new tools? The foremost thing to keep in mind, and this is one of the early foremost principles of physical weed control, is targeting small weeds. And when I'm saying small, these are small weeds. These are huge weeds. So even though you go out there and you see the cod leading of this mustard or this hemp nettle plant, and they look small. You look at the root system already here. You can see that these are already fairly well established, and efficacy with a lot of our tools is going to be, perhaps around 40% for something even this large, whereas efficacy for these white thread weeds will be quite high. So the general principle is shown here. Just keep in mind that with increasing weed size, you should expect a decreasing proportion of weeds killed. And that means you're either going to have them in there interfering with your crop, or that's just going to mean more weeds that you're going to have to go and hand weed. Soil conditions are really important. Making sure that a nice fine seed bed also results often in some nice friable conditions for weeding. Large clods, on the other hand, can sort of protect small seedlings. That can be a real problem. Soil moisture, as I've shown over here, soil moisture can be a real problem. This was actually a surprising result from Ben Costanzi's research summer before last. Ben and I went out to a pretty uniform looking field at our local research farm and cultivated some sweet corn. And at 35 different locations, we measured the mustard mortality, so what is the proportion of weeds we killed, and that's what's shown here, from 0% to 100% weed control. And we also measured the soil moisture using this portable probe at each of the locations. And even though this field looked like it was perfectly ready to cultivate, the soil moisture in the field ranged from around 13% to nearly 22%. So there were sort of wet spots and dry spots. And interestingly, there was an inverse relationship here, such that with increasing soil moisture, we saw a decrease in mustard mortality. Each 1% increase was giving us about an 8% decrease in cultivation efficacy. At this point, there's really nothing you can do about this other than know that this is one of the sources of variation. And actually, one of the things that we're interested in conducting research on in the future is trying to look at this relationship with different types of cultivating tools. I would suspect that perhaps some tools would be more robust in terms of their response to soil moisture, whereas certain tools might be more sensitive. In this particular case, we were weeding with a tine harrow in this case. So that shows a couple of the things to consider regarding increasing efficacy. The last bit here that I want to mention is this notion that the efficacy is density independent. And basically what that means is that if you look at a whole range of weed densities, it's a little cut off here, but this is the density of weeds prior to cultivation from 0 to 200 in this particular graph. And then this is the proportion of weeds we killed after cultivation. You can see that it's a cloud of points with kind of a straight line here, somewhere around 75%. And so that means that we're killing 75% of the weeds, whether we're starting down here with 25 weeds or whether we're up here at 150 weeds. And again, what that means is that we're killing 75%, but 25% are surviving. And 25% of a low initial population might be an acceptable number of survivors, whereas 25% of a high initial population is often not an acceptable density. Here's just another example, again, the cloud here with sort of an average around 65% and similar up in here. So what can be done about this? Well, basically you have to move your way down this direction. So again, this is initial density of weed seedlings from very few to very many, and so you would need to start with fewer weed seedlings. And the only way to start with fewer weed seedlings is to start with fewer weed seeds. And unfortunately, that's a problem for many organic farms. In 2010, my group sampled the seed bank on 23 organic vegetable and dairy farms in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And we looked at the germinable seed bank here. And the first thing I'll point out is this tremendous range from somewhere around 2,500 on up to farm 23 here with 25,000 germinable seeds per square meter to a 10-centimeter depth. So that's a tremendous difference in weed pressure. Another thing that I'll point out, though, is that there's very few that I would consider low. So just by way of orienting you, low in this case would be somewhere down here around 2,500. So we have a lot that are in this moderate range, but then another large group that is in this area that I would call high. Now, it's not to say that one is good or one is better than the other. It's just different, and they're very successful farmers along this entire continuum. But the options for physical weed control are going to be very different for these farms. Very different for a farm that's starting off with a low weed population like this than another farm with a very high weed population. Okay, and so that leads me then to the last section of the presentation, and that is some strategies to actually consider for reducing the seed bank. So if one were to choose to try to move from that right-hand section over to the left, what are some strategies if you don't want to simply cultivate more, to kill, if you're starting out with 25,000 weeds and you get 2,500 of them showing up as weed seedlings, and then you cultivate and you kill 50% each time. If you don't want to simply add more and more cultivation events, killing 50% and then 50% and then 50%, and you've already tried your options for cultivating better in terms of adjusting and getting closer to the row and so on, then there are some strategies to actually start off with a lower initial population. Before I get into the strategies in particular, I want to note that there are really 2 points that are most essential in this way of thinking, and that is thinking about disturbance and notably the timing of this disturbance. These are really essential for a strategy to manage the weed seed bank. And the timing has to consider the phenology of the weed or weed species that you're targeting. And most important in this regard are the germination profile. So if we look at an annual weed here going from the seed bank, germinating, making seedlings, immature plants, mature plants, and so on, how can we time our disturbance events? And here I've shown a few disturbance events with this little sort of diamond-shaped pointy thing. How can we time our disturbance events so that they are at peak times for germination? So we want to encourage lots of germination, lots of depletion of the seed bank, making lots of seedlings, that then a subsequent disturbance event will kill those seedlings. Secondly, we need to think about the phenology of growth and, most importantly, seed rain. When does this weed produce seed, and are we able to time a disturbance event such that seed rain is preempted? So these are the 2 keys. Preempting seed rain means 0 additions to the seed bank for this year. And yes, even though there are seeds in the soil, it turns out that most of the seeds are germinating and dying within the first couple years after being added to the seed bank. So it's important to not focus on the seeds necessarily that persist for 10 years, because most of them don't do that. Most of them die or germinate in a much shorter time. For annual grasses like foxtail, the half-life is much less than a year. So that means 50% of the new seeds are gone in less than a year. Yes, some of them are going to last for a couple of years, but most of them do not. So keeping in mind the disturbance and timing. And here's a nice example from Dave Mortenson's group at Penn State, looking at emergence profiles for different annual weeds. Again, this timing of disturbance is going to vary depending on whether you're targeting, for example, hairy Gallansoga or perhaps horseweed, Caniza canadensis. So summer fallowing, for example, is not going to do anything to deplete your Caniza, your horseweed seed bank. It simply doesn't want to germinate at that time. Okay, so now what are some of the strategies? This leads to the first strategy, and that is to use timely fallowing to deplete the seed bank. And this is something that somebody might want to consider, particularly if the seed bank is very high. And this is the strategy that has been made very well known by Ann and Eric Nordell, probably the foremost ecologically based weed managers in the U.S., if not anywhere. And the practices that they employ in order to make sure that they minimize hand weeding are preventing seed drain, plowing very shallow so that they maintain the weed seed bank up in the upper soil profile, so it's kind of in what I would call the active zone, so the area where seeds are going to want to respond to germination cues. And they use very intentional cover cropping sequences so that they can have fallow events that are timed for optimal germination of the weeds that they're targeting. If this is a summer annual, it would be in the midsummer. If this is a winter annual, it might be in the early spring or later in the fall. Just the impact of this to show you, I sampled the seed bank at 15 different fields at the Nordell's Beech Grove Farm in Trout Run in 2009, and also a couple of farms that I work with here in Maine. This is where we just take we take a soil sample and we spread it in a greenhouse flat here, and then we water it, and we can simply count and identify what comes up. And this is how we characterize the germinable seed bank. And you can see the effect of this fallowing period over here in one of the soil samples from the Nordell's farm. Here's yet another example. This is one of the weedier fields. And I'll just zoom in here and show you what the dominant species was in this field. It turned out to be a volunteer tomato. So that'd be sort of a nice problem to have. We've done some research here looking at different cover cropping and cropping strategies that might be employed following a large seed bank. So asking the question, well, what practices would best be used in a year following a heavy seed rain to deplete the seed bank, to reduce the seed bank back to a low or acceptable level? We looked at we established some synthetic seed banks in frost season, and then the following year during the sowing season, we grew a cash crop, a fall cover crop.
Eric?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt for a second. Your headset is buzzing really loudly, so I'm just not sure. You might have to stop for a second. You might need to unplug it and then plug it in again, because we're all having trouble hearing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know.
It's okay. Yeah, try. Just hold on, everybody, for a second while he does that, because basically we can't hear you at all now. You can go to the audio section of your control panel too, and then ask it to switch it to the phone and then back to the headset again. That doesn't work.
How does it sound now, Alice?
Oh, much better. Thank you. I'm really glad. Okay, so if you could just backtrack just a tiny bit there, because everybody just totally lost you for a moment.
Okay, so how far back should I go?
Just maybe a slide or so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was fine. It just happened about 1 minute ago. So. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was just on my end, but we all had it. So
okay.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Sorry.
All right. So, well, I can't seem to back up. So the last slide I had shown there was simply one of the close-ups of the Nordell's flat that showed the most abundant weed, which happened to be a volunteer tomato. And then I was trying to transition into this example of an experiment that we conducted. Looking at different cropping practices after a seed rain event, after an abundant seed rain event. And so we went out and we put a known number of weed seeds in the soil, and then cash cropped and used an oat red clover cover crop in another treatment, and an oat pea cover crop with a fall rye vetch. And then we had a sort of a cover crop intensive system where we had a condiment mustard followed by buckwheat, followed by a fall brassica, and then a fifth system, which was the same disturbance regimes that we had right here, only without the cover crops. And so, again, the question was related to, okay, if we had seed rain, what practice could be used the following year to reduce the weed seed bank? So we put a known number of weed seeds out in the soil. Prior to establishing the experiment, we collected soil samples and quantified the weed seed bank. We seeded these down with 2,500 velvet leaf or yellow foxtail seeds. And so we took soil samples at the beginning of the experiment. I should say we put the seeds out here, then we took the soil samples, and then we imposed the following spring fallowing, buckwheat, brassica, buckwheat, brassica, a cash crop with rye vetch, oat pea, and then the oat red clover. And this system would have numerous disturbance events, whereas this system would have had only one disturbance event here at the beginning. And then the following spring, we soil sampled again and measured the seed bank again. So we're looking at sort of the single year, single growing season effect of these practices on reducing the weed seed bank. And shown here in this bottom panel is velvet leaf. So here's some velvet leaf seed. And the white bar is the seed density at the start of the experiment. And then the black bar is the following year. And so the difference between these two bars is showing you the single season depletion effect. And the letters on the bars, if they're the same, mean that they're not significantly different from one another. And the notable result here is that with the exception of this oat red clover that it only had one soil disturbance event, all of the rest of these reduced the seed bank of velvet leaf similarly. You know, this had 4 disturbance events, 4, 3, 2, and only 1. And when there was only one soil disturbance event, the depletion of the seed bank was the lowest. And so this is making it look like it's not necessarily the particular crop, but it's rather the frequency and the timing of the disturbance that's important. We see this also with yellow foxtail. It has a little bit more transient seed bank, less long-lived, but notice all 3 of these systems that had the higher levels of soil disturbance, the brassica, buckwheat brassica, the cash crop, and the fallow, all reduced the seed bank similarly. And it was only these second 2 that had fewer disturbance events where the seed bank persisted. So this is leading to this conclusion then. The last one I'm showing here is Chenopodium album, so common lamb's quarters. And we see something very similar, although in the field pea system we actually had lamb's quarter go to seed. But the overall conclusion here is that it's really not necessarily the cover crops per se, but rather the disturbance, and the timing of the disturbance is what ends up being really key. It's not to say that cover crops are bad and they can't contribute to weed management in other ways, but the real key here is really the disturbance, and you can see that by looking at this fallow alone system. So there's some strategies to try to recover the seed bank. The second strategy I wanted to talk about, and I'll go through this fairly quick, it seems like I'm talking a little bit more slowly than I had hoped, is to prevent seed rain. And this is something that we demonstrated. Here's my crew completely weeding a melon area at the piecemeal farm one fall to sort of demonstrate, well, what would happen to this site if we completely prevented seed rain? And this no seed rain strategy ended up having a really dramatic effect even within 1 year. So we went out the next spring and measured the weed seed bank in an area where we hadn't weeded, and then in an area where we had no seed rain. And you can see that in this demonstration it reduced the seed bank by 45%. And at another site the following year, it reduced the seed bank in one season by 93%. So this is showing that fact. And this is a site, the 2008 site was a site that had a lot of annual grasses, so a more short-lived seed bank. So this is showing that, yes, while it's true seeds are designed to persist in the soil, a lot of the weed pressure that you see each spring is really coming from the immediately preceding year's crop of weed seed. And so preventing that can have a really dramatic effect even in 1 year. The last bit that I wanted to talk about is related to managing seed rain. It's not always possible to completely preempt seed rain, but we can manage it to try to enhance seed losses due to predators and, it turns out, due to germination. Here's one of my own train wrecks. This is an example of a late season winter squash field. And if you take some of these pigweeds and thresh them, you see that you have quite an abundant amount of viable seed. And you know, one of the things that most of us would like to do after an event like that is to simply mow the weeds, chisel, disc, plant a fall cover crop, and then look at it and go, oh, isn't that beautiful? I'm just going to forget that squash planting ever happened. And the problem with this, though, is that it just took that entire population of weed seeds that were on the soil surface where predators could find them, and it buried them into the soil profile where they're now being protected from seed predators and less likely to respond to germination cues. We tested this theory, this hypothesis on farm for a couple of years using no-till fall cover cropping at Rob Johansson's place. We put out these cages right here. The cursor is showing up here, but you can see this row of cages here. These are exclosures to prevent animals from consuming any weed seeds. And then we measured the seed bank the next spring inside the cage where there should be a lot of weeds because animals can't get in there to eat, and then outside the cage where the animals could eat the weed seeds. And in the first year of the study, it was a complete bust. You can see that we have the same number of weed seeds, 28,800 inside the exclosure as outside the exclosure. But then in the second year of the study, eureka, 42% fewer seeds outside the exclosures. A very large predation effect, and with great enthusiasm, we then repeated the experiment and unfortunately should not have repeated it. Again, no seed predation in the third year of the study. We did this a fourth year, and again, no seed predation. So we find that seed predation, when it does happen, can be a very dramatic ecological service, but it's highly variable, and we're still trying to figure out what are the sources of some of this variation. I've got just a couple more things to finish up here. The last bit related to this on-farm trial that was sort of a surprising result was that I don't really think there's a downside to this managing to keep the seeds at the soil surface. Here's Rob showing a massive flush of lamb's quarters due to a freak warm weather event in April. So we have a ton of early season germination losses in addition to the occasional year of predation. So I'll conclude with a few summary points related to the seed bank. Again, this is not to say that people don't have fields and are farming very successfully in each of these sort of low, medium, or high category situations. But from a crop management perspective, if you want to manage the seed bank to move from these higher areas to lower areas, you have to ask, what are your options for cash or cover crops? And if you have a low seed bank, you have lots of options, whereas with a higher seed bank, this is where you might consider fallowing. Can I preempt, can I encourage emergence losses, and can I preempt weed seed rain? How effective am I going to be at cultivation? And this is where you have to just know how good you are with your tools. And then what is the likelihood of a lot of seed rain or of being able to preempt seed rain? The point of this throughout is to keep considering the phenology of these weeds and opportunities for trying to maximize the debits to the seed bank while minimizing the credits to the seed bank. There we go. I don't know if I'm one slide ahead now. That sort of wraps it up. Thank you for your attention. I've got three final slides here to point you to places where you can get a little bit more information. Here's our research group's website. There's an area here called Weed Management that has links to quite a lot of tools. our blog, which was not very active last summer, but has quite a lot in it about the Weed Master. And then finally, our YouTube site, zeroseedrain, where you can actually watch quite a number of videos on, in particular, the Weed Master and some of our physical weed control in cereals. So there you go.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eric. I'll just sort of move those slides backwards as we're doing our question and answer session for those people that might have missed those links and might want them. So now let's move on to the questions. We already have quite a few questions coming in. The first one goes back to the beginning of the presentation. Someone wanted to know the name of that tool where the person is hand weeding, lying face down with the headrest. Where people might be able to find information on that and what it's called.
I think it's called the Crawler, and the web address would be, I'm pretty sure it's available through the same person, through Petra Leonin's site, who's selling the Weed Master.
Okay, yeah, we put that link in the chat box, actually, of where...
Elomasteri, did you guys find?
Okay, actually, yeah, I did find it, so I'll...
elomasteri.com or some such thing.
Yeah, let me see if I can find that in a moment while we're answering another question. I'll put that in the chat box for people. Let's see. What can be done in wet years when mechanical cultivation isn't possible on a regular schedule?
Yeah, I mean, that ends up being... So the question about wet years, there are relatively, especially in a heavy soil, there are few tools that are going to work well in wet years. And it's one of the examples where you need to have a tool that can target larger weeds. So, for example, in cereals, we've been doing some work with growing cereals in wider rows so that we can actually use a hoe, an inter-row hoe. So we're growing the organic wheat or barley like a row crop, and it's primarily for that issue. You basically are not, all of those things that are targeting the small white thread stage weeds in the crop row, those are not going to work when the soil conditions are wet, and so you're left with sort of sweeps or hillers or something that's far, far more aggressive. And that's also sort of one of the things that I sort of use to argue for perhaps managing to have a lower seed bank, because at least your starting population ends up being lower in that case.
Okay, here's a question about flaming. You mentioned onions, but what other crops will withstand flame weeding after they've come up?
To be honest, I probably am not so I have not done much post-emergence flaming. I think I know farmers who are doing it in corn, and you get a little bit of damage, but the growing point of the corn is pretty well protected. I'm not going to recommend anything beyond that, though. I don't have a lot of experience with post-emergence flaming. The most common use for flaming tends to be pre-emergence in really slow to establish crops like beets or carrots. And in that case, you basically wait. The carrots emerge so slowly that you go out and flame the day before the carrots are going to crack through the ground, or a couple days before. So that's probably one of the more useful aspects.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. I did type the link to the Elomasteri website, which has some of these the Weed Master tool and that hand weeding tool, and that you can find in your chat box there. So here's the next question. Generally speaking, how often should we be weeding to catch weeds at the white thread stage? For example, should we cultivate each field once per week, once every 2 weeks, or what schedule would you recommend?
Yeah, so it's one of those things that it probably is going to average once a week, but the key thing is, just think about how your crops are emerging, and it's really going to be driven more by moisture and temperature. And so if you cultivate and then it stays really dry and cool for several days, you're not going to get a lot of weed germination going on. So it's going to be driven by the same factors that encourage your crops to come up quickly. So If it's warm and moist, then you're going to have germination occurring more quickly, and you might have to do it more frequently. One of the things that you can do is just go and take your hand into the soil and sort of rake it around like a rake and lift up the soil and sort of shake it free and start looking for those sprouts that are actually in the soil, looking for those white threads even before they come up. Another trick is to sort of put like a little terrarium out in a couple of spots. Put a piece of glass down or like a clear plastic dome from a plant starting flat and basically create a small greenhouse. And then when you see seedlings established in that, you know that everything else is going to be a day or two behind, and so it's probably a good time to go.
Okay, great. Can you give some examples of really effective systems as opposed to tools for reducing the weed seed bank?
That's what I was attempting to do with sort of highlighting that sort of timing and disturbance idea, and also trying to feature that data set where we could show that the seed bank was depleted quite similarly, whether we were growing a green bean cash crop that was cultivated intensely or using a brassica, buckwheat brassica cover crop. And so it's really, I'm sort of convinced that it's not like there's a particular system or rotation sequence or cover crop that is going to deal with this. It's really the management that is done within any of those crops that are grown. And it's really thinking about timing the disturbance. So if you're, for example, cultivating your green bean crop, that is a de facto kind of a seed bank depleting activity. You're killing weed seedlings, but you're also stirring up the soil and encouraging another flush to germinate, and then you cultivate those out again. And it's sort of like summer fallowing, only in that case you've got a crop present. So it's really not, I don't really think it's about any particular rotation or cover crop, but it's really about the management that you impose within any system that you choose to use.
Okay, thanks. Could you talk about the efficacy of black plastic?
Okay, efficacy of black plastic. It's really high. It's great. People love it in terms of the weed control contributions. It's people don't love it because of the kind of carbon footprint and the disposal issues. The edges of black plastic are a real challenge, and you can look at actually some of Vern Grubinger's videos that are posted to eOrganic. There's a couple of clever ways to get cultivation tools to try to deal with weeds along the edges of the plastic. Anyways, it's there's really not a downside from a weed management perspective. It really does a great job. I mean, the only things that are going to come through that I've ever seen tend to be, like yellow nutsedge or some such thing. And actually, we've got some evidence that the black plastic also helps to kind of reduce the seed bank underneath where the plastic is during the year, because it's nice and warm and you have a lot of sort of germination going on over the course of the season. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, there were a couple of questions about that. So let's see. What about crabgrass and wiregrass? What are the best disturbance times for those, and what would be a good strategy so as not to spread the roots around?
So I'm not sure what wiregrass is, but crabgrass, so the digitarias, that's one of the bigger problems that the vegetable growers in this region are having. Actually, even some of the dairy farmers in their annual crops, and it's a very it's a warm season crop, so it's not going to really respond. It's not going to start germinating until temperatures are very warm. It's kind of related to corn in its carbon metabolism, so it likes it when it's sort of hot and dry out. And so it's going to be something that in the heat of the summer is when it's going to want to be germinating. The other thing to keep in mind with crabgrass is that the seeds thresh free of the seed head very quickly and very easily. So you see that little digit panicle out there. It looks like a chicken foot. And if you look at that very closely, you'll see seeds on it very early, but then quite quickly they drop from the mother plant. One final thing that we're just now doing some on-farm testing with is actually flaming crabgrass seeds, and they seem to be reasonably sensitive to flaming. Although, again, we've just started doing work on this, so I don't want to go too far in recommending that. So.
Okay, yeah. Are any of the European tools that you showed available commercially in the United States?
Or
can they be?
They're not available commercially. What I'm seeing happening is some of the mid-scale growers, so somebody with 50 acres or so who is tired of searching and repairing old Alice G's, they're basically getting a couple of them to coordinate and working together and ordering a container shipment of these tools from Europe. And the same thing with buying a tractor is they're basically going over, taking a tour of in the Netherlands or Germany and looking at some of these manufacturers and then just buying them. And I'm not sure why it is that this hasn't really caught on here, and we're still scrabbling for Alice G's and those beautiful old offset Kubota diesels and whatnot. The couple of manufacturers that tried to get going here, there was one called the Tough Built, but I'm pretty sure that they are back out of business, and then the Sockville, and I don't know if they're making them or not. So unfortunately, there's not a local dealer, and I'll just put in my own little rant here that I've tried twice now to get an ORI grant, a U.S. government grant, to import these tools, to get them out on farms, making the argument that people aren't going to adopt this technology unless they can actually physically see them work. And I've been sort of put off that the criticism has fairly consistently been, well, if there's such a great technology out there, farmers would know about it and they would have adopted it. So, I don't know.
Okay. Well, next question. What effect does straw or other organic mulch have on a seed bank?
Oh, let's see. That's a good question. What effect does straw have on the seed bank? I honestly don't know. We've never specifically tested that. My sense is what should happen is that it should cause the surface seed bank to be reduced because the straw is going to maintain moisture there, and even though it's going to be cooler, I would suspect that over the whole growing season that you have sort of more favorable conditions for weeds to germinate. We have done some work where we've tried looking at seed deterioration, like microbial decay in compost amended and unamended soils, and we did not detect any differences there. But we have not done the straw experiment. It's a good idea, though.
Okay. We have a couple questions about whether you would recommend cover cropping between rows or mulching between, or using weed fabric between rows.
We have done some, the idea of the cover crop, sort of the living mulch thing, is just beguiling. I've done several years of work with this, and it's some of my favorite photographs. They're just gorgeous to see, black plastic and then this beautiful, clover or ryegrass growing in between. But the problem is just managing the competition. That sod, if it looks good and it's competing against weeds, is basically a giant sod of weeds in and of itself. And so honestly, the most favorable results we've had have been using a heavy straw mulch in between the plastic mulch beds. And the smaller scale growers that are interested in improving soil quality are fairly keen on this because they basically look at the expensive straw as something they depreciate both for a full season of weeding and then soil carbon.
Okay. You haven't talked about the application of GPS-guided tractors and cultivation equipment, as well as GPS-planted crops that allow precision infra-row computer-guided equipment. Yes, it's expensive, but it might facilitate larger-scale mechanical weed management. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's why I did present that precisely because I think that if you were to run the numbers that at a larger scale, I don't think it would take very long to pay for some of this technology. If you look at the guidance system and the increased precision as well as the increased working rate, I would be surprised that at least for moderate value crops, if you couldn't pay for that in a fairly short order. So I think that the guidance systems are they are farm ready for sure. You know, that Garford system is one, the EcoDan camera. In terms of the GPS guidance system, I have less experience with those, and most of the examples that I know about from Europe have not been going with the GPS guidance system. They've been going more with the real-time system. But I think that there's some great technology out there, and again, it's I think just a matter of doing some fairly straightforward partial budgeting to see how long it would take to pay for it.
Okay. Could you talk about opportunities for mowing weeds to prevent seed grain?
Yeah. So the key thing for preventing seed rain, so mowing is something that people really like to do. It's really ranked up fairly high as a practice that organic farmers do. The important thing if you're trying to prevent seed rain is that you have to go to those seed heads and thresh the seeds in your hands, rub that inflorescence, rub that flower bits, whatever it might be, in between your palms really firmly and get those seeds out of there. And then, look at them, and if they look firm and shiny, they probably are viable. And you can pinch them with a pair of tweezers, and if they pass the pinch test and it feels like a nice, healthy, fresh seed, it probably is, which means that then you're too late. And so if you're going to try to mow, then you need to just be really on top of paying attention to seed maturation. For a few plants, it can happen really rapidly. So at least in the literature, it's reported that Harry Gallandt soga seed is actually mature within 21 days after maybe it's even 14 days after you see the flower. So some of these can mature fairly quickly, and so simply mowing them at that point is, you're preventing further reproduction, but you're not preempting seed rain. Okay,
great. Is there a practical method of measuring seed banks for an individual farmer?
The method that we use is really simple, but it's a bit tedious. So the method we use is we just like you would take soil samples for measuring soil fertility, we just take soil cores randomly around a field to a depth of 10 centimeters, so a 4-inch depth. We spread them on a greenhouse flat that has vermiculite in it, so that the layer of field soil is only about half of an inch thick, and then we water it. And so it's pretty easy to do. And then you just have to water it, and then as the seedlings come up, you simply count them and pull them out. After about a month, we typically will dry the flat back down and then homogenize the soil and spread it back out and do that again and do it for 3 or 4 cycles. But you could get a pretty good idea just with that first flush.
Okay, we had several questions on that video about for controlling weeds at the edge of plastic mulch. Was that the Vern Grubinger video that you were talking about? Yeah, okay, yeah.
It's in vegetable farmers and their weed control machines, but unfortunately I don't remember which particular clip it is.
Okay, well, John thankfully just posted the link in the chat box for some of Vern's DVDs, and they're available for free online at the extension.org website, which is eOrganic's website, and John just posted the links to those. So we'd had a few questions about that, so I just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention, make sure that was the right one that you were talking about.
Yes.
So that's great. Well, we have time for a couple more questions. We have so many coming in, but we have time for a few more. Let's see, what strategies, rotations, or cover crops have you found most effective for controlling Canadian thistles?
I knew somebody was going to have to bring up perennial weeds. Yeah, so most of my work, as evidenced from the talk, is really focused on annual weeds. And so I personally haven't done research with perennials. They're just not the top problem in this particular region. It is they are the top problem in Northern Europe, and again, this is one of the reasons why some grain growers in Northern Europe again are using this wide row cereal system, because they can use inter-row hoeing to control Canada thistle and coltsfoot, and to a lesser extent quackgrass. The general principle for perennial weeds is knowing a bit about their biology and then trying to time your disturbance so that you're encouraging the above ground growth and encouraging that plant to deplete its below ground food reserves. And so, for example, with Canada thistle in the spring as it starts growing, if you till that and then wait about 3 weeks and let it regrow and then till it again, you can keep doing that, and the idea is that every time that plant regrows, it's depleting below ground food reserves. And so one of the strategies would be to think about, well, what crops in my rotation, what choices do I have that could incorporate sort of that 3-week tillage kind of window? And there's probably not a lot of them, but there may be something there. But that's the general principle, is sort of that kind of timely disturbance, and that disturbance could be a whole field fallow, or it could be a well-adjusted inter-row cultivator.
Okay, I think this is going to have to be our final question. It's sort of a two-part question. Is there any evidence that allelopathy cover crops such as rye are effective at inhibiting germination? And is there evidence of cover crops such as sorghum shading out or outcompeting weeds as an effective solution? Are these simply theory or a real solution?
Both of those. So allelopathy is well documented, and it occurs, I would say, probably with most cover crops, and it's going to occur to a larger extent with certain species than others. Rye ends up being really sort of famous because we happen to know the precise chemicals in rye that tend to be most toxic, but all plants, when you incorporate them into the soil and they start breaking down and releasing all of their plant constituents into the soil, a lot of those chemicals are supposed to be inside the plant cells and inside the vacuoles, and they're not really good for other plants. And so this, I think, allelopathy, or these sort of chemical phytotoxic effects, are occurring whenever we incorporate green manure into the soil. And yes, it's going to reduce the establishment of small seeded weeds. It will also reduce the establishment, though, of small seeded crops. So the allelechemicals here are not going to distinguish between a carrot seed and a pigweed seed. So yes, that is part of what's happening, but there's a lot of other things that are going on with those sort of residue-mediated effects. You have increased microbial activity, and you have sometimes nitrogen immobilization, sometimes release of nitrogen. So it's a sort of a quite a lot of mechanisms going on there. And then in terms of shading, competitive cover crop like Sudan grass or even buckwheat, or any well-managed cover crop is going to shade weeds. And there, it depends on what your benchmark is. If you're comparing the weed suppression to no cover crop, the cover crop's going to look great. You know, you're going to have tiny weeds, and they're not going to have so many seeds. But if you look inside your Sudan grass, and this happened in our own student farm 2 summers ago. They had a beautiful stand of Sudan grass, but when I dug around deep...
Uh-oh, we're getting a lot of interference again. Eric, we can't hear you.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, it's okay. We can't hear you. The headset is... Yeah.
Shall we plug in?
Yeah, I think you should, just for the last question here. Sorry about that. We lost you about 20 seconds ago.
Where?
Here we go.
Okay, am I
yep,
back
much,
now?
much
Okay.
better. Yes, yes, thank you.
Just to finish that up, you know, this Sudan grass crop looked beautiful, but when you dug into it, it was loaded with hairy Gallansoga, and it was all going to seed. And yes, there was less Gallansoga there than at the ends of the field where there was no Sudan grass, but there was still plenty going to seed. So.
Okay, well, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for all this great information. And I just wanted to mention to everybody, again, if you have additional questions, you're welcome to use the Ask an Expert system at extension.org/ask. The link is up on your screen. And this webinar, the recording of it, will be posted on the eOrganic website at extension.org/organic_production under upcoming and archived webinars. The direct link is there on your screen, where you can also see our upcoming webinar schedule and all of our other recorded webinars. Thank you so much, Eric, for this presentation, and thank you all for joining us.
Yes, thank you all. It was very fun.